On Tuesday, the United States Senate did something it has never done before. It passed a war powers resolution that had already cleared the House, directing the president to end a war. By Wednesday night, that historic vote had been quietly reversed. The European Union just agreed to buy at least $40 billion in American AI chips as part of a pact explicitly designed to break dependence on China, and immediately started arguing internally about whether the deal actually creates a different dependence instead. And a Michael Jackson biopic just became the highest-grossing music film ever made, while sitting on one of the widest critic-audience splits of the entire year. Let's get into all three. Start with the Senate, because what happened over those 48 hours is one of the clearest demonstrations all year of how thin congressional resolve actually is when a president decides to apply direct pressure. On Tuesday afternoon, the Senate voted 50-48 to pass a concurrent resolution directing President Trump to remove U.S. armed forces from hostilities with Iran or seek congressional authorization to continue. 4 Republicans crossed party lines to join nearly every Democrat: Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Rand Paul of Kentucky. 1 Democrat, John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, voted against it. This wasn't a fringe procedural moment. It was, as Al Jazeera reported, the first time in American history that a war powers resolution successfully passed both chambers of Congress, since the House had already approved its own version, 215-208, earlier in the month. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called it the 10th time the chamber had taken up a resolution to rein in Trump's Iran campaign, and didn't hide his contempt for how long it had taken. For years, Trump promised to put maximum pressure on Iran, but he ended up delivering maximum confusion, maximum chaos, maximum cost to the American people with his disastrous war. Trump's response, posted to Truth Social within hours, set the tone for everything that followed. 4 Republican losers voted with the Democrats, and Iran asked my people. What does that all mean? These senators have just made my job more difficult. But I will get it done, one way or the other, because I always get it done. That's not a measured policy disagreement. That's a direct, public threat of consequences aimed at members of his own party for exercising what is, on paper, one of Congress's most fundamental constitutional powers, the power to check the use of military force. Here's where the story turns genuinely damning. Senate Republicans brought a nearly identical resolution back to the floor, not to pass it again, but specifically to kill it. And 2 of the 4 Republicans who had voted for the original resolution one day earlier changed their votes entirely. Rand Paul switched from yes to present. Bill Cassidy switched from yes to a direct no. What changed in those 24 hours wasn't new information about the war. What changed was that both men received what CNN described as a thorough briefing from Vice President J.D. Vance and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. A meeting that, by Cassidy's own account, posted to X, happened specifically because Trump personally asked me to give consideration to his negotiating position. Cassidy was explicit about the mechanics of his own reversal. My opinion on the debate over war and executive power has not changed, and I have voted that way several times. But since hostilities seem to be over, and the president asked me to give consideration to his negotiating position, I will do so. Read that statement closely, because it's an admission, not a defense. Cassidy is saying, in his own words, that his constitutional position on the limits of executive war power did not change between Tuesday and Wednesday. What changed was that the president personally lobbied him, invited him to the White House, and asked him to vote differently, and he did. Senator James Risch of Idaho had warned on the floor before the original vote that passage would hand Iran propaganda. If this passes, the Iranians are going to simply stand up and walk away from negotiations. They're going to say, "This thing's over. The Congress has told the President of the United States, leave us alone." Risch also called the whole exercise essentially useless, given its non-binding, symbolic nature. If that's true, if the resolution truly had no practical effect on anything, then the urgency with which Vance and Witkoff personally summoned 2 senators to flip their votes within 24 hours becomes even harder to explain as anything other than what it looks like: a president demonstrating, in real time, that even a historic, bipartisan, both chambers rebuke of his war powers can be unwound through direct personal pressure on individual members. A Reuters and Ipsos poll released the same week found only 24% of Americans felt the war had been worth its cost. The chamber that's constitutionally supposed to represent that 76% of dissent folded within a single news cycle. That's Washington eating itself over a war. Now to a very different kind of alliance building, where the stated goal is independence and the actual mechanics look a little more like dependency with better branding. The European Union formally joined Pax Silica this week, a US-led initiative coordinated by the State Department and launched in December 2025, designed to secure semiconductor and AI supply chains and reduce reliance on China. The EU's accession came with a specific headline-grabbing commitment. As part of the joint statement, the bloc agreed to purchase at least $40 billion worth of American AI chips. Germany, Greece, and the Netherlands joined alongside the broader EU bloc around June 23rd, adding to an existing roster that already included Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Israel, Qatar, the UK, and the UAE. Since the EU's accession, Australia, Finland, Norway, the Philippines, and Sweden have also signed on, making this one of the fastest-growing multilateral technology pacts in recent memory. On its face, this looks like exactly the kind of allied coordination that gets praised in foreign policy circles. Democracies banding together to reduce a single point of failure in critical technology supply chains, covering everything from critical mineral extraction to chip fabrication to AI deployment. CBS News framed the entire effort as the West trying to break its reliance on Chinese artificial intelligence supply chains. That's the official story, and it's not wrong on its face. Here's the part that deserves real scrutiny, and it's the part Euronews and Global Times both independently surfaced from opposite political perspectives, which makes the convergence worth noting. The EU's internal deliberations over whether to join Pax Silica were genuinely contentious for weeks, specifically because Paris and several other capitals raised pointed concerns about the initiative's governance, its relationship with the G7, and, most importantly, whether it would compromise the EU's own strategic autonomy, particularly around export controls and foreign investment screening. Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands pushed hard in favor, arguing the bloc needed to present a united front toward Washington. France and others wanted clarity first. The European Commission ultimately had to explicitly confirm that the Pax Silica declaration is non-binding and won't interfere with the EU's internal decision-making before enough capitals would sign on. That reassurance is worth examining skeptically, rather than accepting at face value. A professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University, quoted by Global Times, admittedly a state-linked outlet with an obvious interest in this framing, which deserves its own grain of salt, made an argument that doesn't actually require you to trust Chinese state media to find persuasive. The EU's own Chips Act was explicitly designed to build European technological self-reliance, and a $40 billion commitment to buy American chips runs in the opposite direction of that goal. You can want to reduce dependence on Beijing and still recognize that signing a non-binding declaration with no dedicated joint funding, no enforcement mechanism, and a $40 billion procurement commitment to a single supplier, the United States, doesn't obviously produce resilience. It produces a different, singular dependency, dressed in the language of diversification. The supply chain digital coverage of Pax Silica describes it accurately as having no dedicated joint funding attached to it, and no mandates compelling member nations to take specific actions. That's a polite way of saying it's mostly a political statement with a very expensive shopping list attached. None of this means Pax Silica is worthless, or that coordinating with allies against an authoritarian rival's chip dominance is the wrong instinct. It is, however, worth being honest about what kind of document this actually is. A symbolic declaration of alignment, backed by a real and substantial financial commitment in one direction, with internal disagreement among the EU's own member states about whether reducing dependency on China and committing $40 billion to American suppliers are actually the same goal or just rhyme with each other in a press release. Because two stories about institutions bending under pressure deserve a third story about something that doesn't require any pressure at all to be complicated. Let's talk about a movie. Michael, the Michael Jackson biopic directed by Antoine Fuqua and produced with extensive involvement from the Jackson estate, has now surpassed Bohemian Rhapsody to become the highest-grossing music biopic in history, with worldwide grosses approaching $960 million and a real path toward crossing the billion-dollar mark. It's currently sitting at number 2 on the entire 2026 global box office chart. The film has performed exceptionally well internationally. It became the first 2026 release to cross $20 million in Russia, held up strongly in Japan after its opening weekend, and remains a top performer in Brazil. John Branca, the veteran entertainment lawyer who's represented the Jackson estate since 1980, framed the film's success as evidence that audiences wanted to see Jackson's artistry separated from decades of headlines and controversy. Here's the detail that the box office triumphalism tends to skip past, and it's worth naming directly, rather than treating it as a footnote. The contrast between critical reception and audience reception for this film has become, in the Washington Informer's own words, one of the year's most notable entertainment stories. And that gap isn't incidental. It reflects a genuinely unresolved question that no box office number actually answers. What does it mean that a film produced in direct partnership with the estate that financially benefits from Jackson's legacy, an estate that has spent decades managing serious, well-documented allegations of child sexual abuse against Jackson, allegations that were the subject of a major HBO documentary and years of litigation, has become one of the most successful music biopics ever made, marketed explicitly around separating the artistry from the controversy. I'm not going to tell you whether you should or shouldn't watch this movie, and I'm not interested in moralizing about individual entertainment choices. But the framing Branca offered, that the film succeeds because it captures something often lost beneath decades of headlines and controversy, deserves to be examined, rather than just repeated as a marketing line. The allegations against Jackson weren't a media invention or an unfair headline cycle. They were the subject of a 1993 settlement, a 2005 criminal trial, and the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland, which presented detailed accounts from two men who say they were abused by Jackson as children. A biopic produced with the direct cooperation of an estate that has every financial incentive to manage that history favorably is not a neutral retelling. It's an authorized one. And the difference between those two things matters enormously when the subject's legacy includes serious unresolved harm allegations. Nearly $1 billion in box office doesn't settle that question. It just tells you that a well-made film, backed by a massive marketing campaign and genuine nostalgia for Jackson's musical genius, can generate enormous audience enthusiasm, regardless of how that question gets resolved. Both things, the genuine scale of Jackson's talent and the genuine seriousness of the allegations against him, are true at the same time, and a box office record doesn't require you to pick only one to take seriously. 3 very different stories today. Historic congressional rebuke of a president's war powers got unwound within 24 hours by 2 phone calls and a White House meeting, with one senator admitting on the record that his constitutional position never changed, only his willingness to act on it. A 27-country alliance committed itself to reducing dependence on China by committing $40 billion to dependence on the United States instead, and called it resilience. And a movie about one of the most talented and most legally troubled entertainers in modern history just became one of the most financially successful films of the year, built on a framing that asks audiences to set aside exactly the questions that made his legacy complicated in the first place. In all 3 cases, the headline version of the story is the one that's easiest to tell. The version underneath it, a senator's own words contradicting his vote, a resilience pact built on a single new dependency, a biopic's box office success, measured against the allegations its marketing is explicitly designed to move past, is the version that actually tells you something true.